In medieval England, the title of knight stood as the highest symbol of honour and service. To bear a sword in the name of one's king and to live by the code of chivalry was a privilege few could attain. But behind every polished helm and noble crest lay years of hardship, discipline, and devotion. Knighthood was not granted by birthright alone. It had to be earned through a lifetime of obedience, courage, and faith. To understand what it meant to become a knight, we must step back into the 12th century during the reign of King Henry II. England was a land bound together by feudal ties. Every man owed service to one above him, and in return, protection from those below. Kings ruled through barons, barons through knights, and knights through the peasants who tilled their lands. Power was measured not by wealth alone, but by loyalty and land, by oaths sworn and kept. Within this world of duty and hierarchy, the making of a knight was both a personal journey and a political necessity. Our story follows William de Morley, the son of a minor noble family in Norfolk. William's father, Lord Geoffrey de Morley, held a modest manor, several dozen acres of farmland, a wooden hall, and a handful of serfs. Though not wealthy, the family possessed the one thing that mattered most in feudal England: lineage. It was enough to offer their son the chance to pursue knighthood, a path that could elevate both him and his kin. William's early years were marked by simplicity and discipline. He grew up among the bustle of the manor, watching his father dispense justice in the great hall, oversee the harvest and prepare for the occasional call to arms. The boy's mother, Lady Aveline, taught him his prayers and manners, while his father instructed him in the virtues expected of a nobleman: honour, loyalty, courage, and restraint. At the age of 7, William's life would change forever. It was at this age that the long journey toward knighthood traditionally began. At 7, a boy of noble birth was sent away from his family to serve as a page in another lord's household. The decision was both a mark of status and a test of character. To send one's child into another man's service required trust and humility. To be received as a page was an honour that could forge powerful alliances. For William, the destination was the castle of Baron Fitzalan, a respected lord loyal to the king. When the day came, Lady Aveline embraced her son with tears, and Lord Geoffrey offered a final piece of advice: serve with humility, learn with diligence, and one day you may serve no man but your king. As a page, William's life was ruled by routine. He woke before dawn to attend his lord and lady, carrying messages, running errands, and assisting in the household as daily tasks. He learned to serve at the table, carve meat, pour wine, and speak politely. These were not trivial duties. They were lessons in grace and composure, the foundation of a knightess bearing. Every action, no matter how small, was an exercise in discipline and respect. Alongside his chores, William received education suited to his station. He learned to read Latin prayers, to write with quill and parchment, and to play the harp and lute. Music and poetry were not mere amusements. They were expressions of culture and refinement. A knight was expected to be as skilled in courtesy as in combat. Yet the boy's favourite lessons took place in the courtyard, where he trained with wooden swords under the watchful eye of the castle's arms-master. The training of a page was designed to build both strength and spirit. He learned to ride ponies bareback, to shoot a bow, to wrestle, and to mimic the movements of swordplay. Every fall, every bruise was part of his education. He watched older squires and knights at practice, their movements precise and powerful, their armour gleaming in the sun. In them he saw the life he dreamed of, one of valour and freedom. But that dream came at a price. Pages were often the target of teasing and harsh correction. Obedience was demanded, mistakes punished. It was through this early humility that William began to understand what true discipline meant. The lessons of knighthood extended beyond skill. In the evenings, when torches flickered and the castle hall filled with the scent of roasted meat and smoke, the chaplain taught the young pages about chivalry, the moral code that defined the knightly class: to fear God, to defend the church, to protect the weak, to tell the truth, and to act with honour at all times. These tenets were drilled into their minds until they became instinct. The page S world was one of service and preparation, of small acts leading to greater duties. By the time William reached 14, he had grown tall and strong, his manners refined, his courage tested. His years of service had earned the respect of his masters, and it was decided that he was ready for the next stage of his journey. He would become a squire. The transition from page to squire marked the boy's passage into manhood. The ceremony was simple but solemn. Before his lord, William knelt and swore an oath to serve faithfully, to obey without hesitation, and to prepare himself for the honour of knighthood. He was presented with the sword, a symbol of his growing responsibility, and was assigned to serve under Sir Robert Fitzalan, one of the Baroness' most trusted knights. As a squire, William's duties multiplied. No longer a servant of the household, he became the personal attendant of a knight. He cleaned and maintained Sir Robert's armour, cared for his horses, and ensured his weapons were sharp and ready. He learned to fit and remove chainmail, to oil steel so it would not rust, and to dress his master before battle. But this was no mere apprenticeship. It was a relationship of loyalty and mentorship. The knight was teacher, guardian, and judge all in one. Training grew more intense. Each day began with drills mounting and dismounting at speed, striking practice, with sword and lance sparring against other squires. William learned to handle a warhorse, to couch a lance beneath his arm, to aim it true at a charging opponent. He was taught to repair armour, to read the terrain in battle, and to endure fatigue and hunger. The life of a squire was gruelling, but it forged men into warriors. War itself was never far away. England's feudal lords were often called to arms, whether to defend borders, suppress rebellion, or join campaigns in France or the Holy Land. At 16, William rode to battle for the first time following Sir Robert's banner. The sight of hundreds of mounted knights, the sound of clanging armour and snorting horses, filled him with awe and fear in equal measure. On the battlefield, courage was no longer an ideal, it was survival. Though squires were not expected to fight as knights did, they played vital roles. They carried messages, fetched water, tended to the wounded, and sometimes fought beside their masters when needed. William's first taste of combat came during a skirmish against raiders along the Welsh border. The chaos, the screams, the clash of steel, these would remain burned into his memory forever. He saw bravery and brutality side by side. He learned that chivalry, so beautiful in theory, was often tested by the harshness of war. Over the years, William continued to serve faithfully. He accompanied Sir Robert to tournaments' mock battles that tested skill and courage. There he learned the art of the joust, charging with lance lowered, shield raised, meeting another horseman in thunderous collision. Victories brought prestige, and William's skill soon drew attention. Yet his master reminded him that pride was the enemy of virtue. A knight's worth, he said, lay not in his victories but in his honour. By the age of 21, William had fulfilled every expectation of service. His lord Sir Robert, now aging, spoke to Baron Fitzalan on his behalf, recommending that he be considered for knighthood. The Baron agreed. The time had come for William to take the final step on the path he had followed since childhood. The ceremony of knighthood was both sacred and symbolic. In England, it often took place on holy days or before a campaign. William S. was to be held on Easter Eve, a day of renewal and faith. The night before the ceremony, he entered the castle chapel dressed in a simple white tunic, a sign of purity. Before the altar lay his sword and armour. He would spend the entire night in prayer, in what was known as the Vigil of Arms. Alone, surrounded by the flickering light of candles, he contemplated the weight of the vow he was about to take. He prayed for strength, for courage, for the wisdom to live according to the code of chivalry. He reflected on his years of service, on the lessons of humility, loyalty and sacrifice. When dawn broke, he emerged from the chapel transformed in spirit, ready to become what he had long aspired to be. The morning of William de Morley's knighthood began with the quiet tolling of the chapel bell. The sun, low on the horizon, painted the castle stones with pale gold. Servants moved softly through the corridors, preparing the hall for the day's ceremony. Outside, the air was cool and still, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath before history turned its page. William had not slept. All night he had knelt in vigil before the altar, his sword laid across the steps, his mind fixed on the solemn promises he was soon to make. He was no longer the eager boy who had arrived years ago, carrying his father's hopes like a banner. He was now a man tempered by duty, hardship, and reflection. The years of service, the bruises and fears, the lessons learned in silence, all had led to this moment. When dawn broke, he rose and bathed in cold water, a symbol of purification. His white tunic was replaced with garments of red and black, the colours of courage and resolve. His sword, blessed by the priest, was presented to him once more. It would soon hang at his side as a sign of his station, but it would also carry the weight of moral duty. To a knight, the sword was both weapon and cross, a reminder that violence must serve justice. In the great hall, lords, knights, and clergy gathered. At the far end sat Baron Fitzalan, his expression proud but composed. Before him stood Sir Robert, William S. Master, in full armour, the same armour William had polished countless times. And there, at the centre of it all, William knelt. The priest began with prayer, invoking divine blessing upon the ceremony. He spoke of St. George, patron of soldiers, and of the virtue of protecting the weak. William repeated the words of the oath with unwavering voice. He swore to defend the Church and its teachings, to serve his liege lord faithfully, to protect the helpless, and to uphold justice. He promised to speak the truth, to show mercy, and never to flee from the face of the enemy. When the oath was finished, Sir Robert stepped forward. Drawing his sword, he touched William lightly on the shoulder and said, "In the name of God, Saint Michael, and Saint George, I dub thee knight. Be valiant, loyal, and true." It was known as the accolade, the ritual touch that marked the final step from squire to knight. Applause rose in the hall, and William stood. He was now Sir William de Morley, Knight of England, sworn to the service of God, King and Lord. For a moment he felt the enormity of it, the weight of his sword, the eyes of the court, the realization that his life was no longer his own. He was bound by the code he'd vowed to live by, a code that would shape every decision he made henceforth. Knighthood was not a reward, it was a responsibility. In medieval England, knights formed the backbone of feudal society. They were warriors, administrators, and symbols of order. Their loyalty ensured stability between king and noble, between lord and vassal. Each knight swore fealty not, only to his immediate master, but to the greater hierarchy that stretched upward to the crown itself. To betray one's oath was to break the fragile chain that held the realm together. In the days that followed his ceremony, Sir William was granted the right to bear his own coat of arms, a red field with a silver chevron and 3 black stars. Heraldry was more than decoration. It was identity. In battle, a knight's shield proclaimed who he was and whom he served. The colours, symbols and patterns told stories of lineage and loyalty, visible across the smoke and chaos of war. With his new arms, William was no longer merely his father's son, he was a man of standing in his own right. As a newly made knight, William remained in service to Baron Fitzalan. His first duties involved leading small retinues, training younger squires, and managing parts of the Baroness estates. In this, he learned the broader role of knighthood beyond combat. A knight was a protector not only of battlefields but of the peace that followed them. He was expected to administer justice fairly, to ensure that the baron's lands were safe, and to act as an example to those beneath him. Yet peace was fleeting in those years. England under Henry II was a realm of restless ambition. Disputes with the church, campaigns in Normandy, and unrest among the barons kept the kingdom in a near-constant state of motion. For knights like William, service meant readiness at all times. When the baron received summons from the king to join a campaign in France, William was among those chosen to ride with him. Crossing the Channel was a rite of passage for many English knights. In France, the lines between lord and enemy blurred, as many nobles held lands on both sides of the water. William soon discovered that war abroad was not the glorious adventure he had once imagined. It was mud and exhaustion, hunger and disease. It was the long march under rain, the endless waiting before a siege, the sound of arrows hissing through the air. Yet amid the hardship he also saw the honour that came from discipline and unity. A well-ordered host of knights and men-at-arms could hold together even when hope seemed lost. William's first true test as a knight came during a siege near Tours. The enemy had fortified a small castle, and the English forces were ordered to take it by storm. William's company was assigned to the assault. As arrows rained down from the battlements, he led his men forward, shield raised, shouting for them to follow. He reached the base of the wall, planted the ladder, and climbed despite the splinters of wood and the stones hurled from above. Near the top he was struck by a mace, but he did not fall. With a final surge he vaulted over the parapet and fought his way onto the battlements. His courage inspired those behind him, and the fortress soon fell. When it was over, Baron Fitzalan himself commended William for his valour. Word of his deed spread through the camp, and his name began to carry weight. Victories like these built a knight's reputation. Honour was not inherited, it was proven through deeds. Yet even in triumph, William never forgot the contradictions that haunted knighthood. The code of chivalry called for mercy and justice, but war often left little room for either. He saw towns burned, prisoners executed, peasants driven from their homes. For every noble cause proclaimed, there were acts of cruelty committed in its name. It was a lesson he carried with unease, that righteousness and violence often walked hand in hand. When the campaign ended, William returned to England. His service had earned him a modest reward lands near his family's manor, granted by the baron in recognition of his loyalty. For the first time he held land of his own, becoming a lord in miniature. He oversaw fields and tenants, collected rents, and dispensed justice in small disputes. The management of an estate required as much patience as any battle. A knight who could not govern wisely soon found himself destitute, for the cost of armour, horses, and servants was high. Knighthood carried expectations that reached far beyond warfare. A true knight was also a model of Christian virtue. The Church played a powerful role in shaping the ideals of the order. Priests preached that knights were defenders of faith, guardians of the innocent, and instruments of divine will. They were taught that every battle fought for a just cause was a holy act, and that courage in war could mirror the courage of saints facing martyrdom. It was a compelling vision, one that gave meaning to the bloodshed of the age. But not all knights lived up to that ideal. Many used their power to oppress rather than protect, waging private wars or abusing their vassals. The gap between the chivalric code and the realities of feudal life was wide. William knew this all too well, for he had seen both kinds of men, the knight who upheld his oath with honour and the one who broke it for gain. The difference lay not in birth, but in conscience. In his years of service, William found solace in the company of others who shared his sense of duty. Among them was Sir Hugh de Clare, a veteran knight known for his stern sense of justice. From him, William learned that chivalry was not a matter of ceremony, but of daily conduct. "A knight's armour," Sir Hugh once told him, "may shine in sunlight, but it is his heart that must remain untainted in shadow." This philosophy shaped William's conduct in the years that followed. He devoted himself to maintaining peace within his barony, settling disputes among tenants with fairness, and protecting travellers along the roads from bandits. He took part in tournaments not for riches, but to hone his skill and discipline. His life became a balance between sword and conscience, between feudal duty and personal integrity. As time passed, England itself began to change. The Crusades called knights from across Christendom to take up arms in the Holy Land. Preachers spoke of salvation through battle, of sins washed away in the sands of Jerusalem. Many English knights sold their lands or mortgaged their estates to join the crusading armies. The Church promised eternal reward to those who fought in God's name. For men like William, the call was both temptation and trial. To fight for faith was the highest expression of chivalric virtue, but it also meant leaving behind all he had built. William wrestled with the decision. He had seen enough war to know its costs, but he also understood the honour attached to the cross of the Crusader. In the end, he resolved to prepare himself for whatever service his king and conscience might demand. He trained his retainers, repaired his armour, and made peace with his family. Though he did not yet know it, his next great chapter would be written far from the green fields of England. In the late 12th century, the winds of Christendom carried one call above all others, the call to crusade. From the pulpits of England to the markets of London and York, preachers stirred the hearts of nobles and peasants alike with tales of Jerusalem of the Holy Sepulchre defiled, of pilgrims attacked on sacred roads, of a duty ordained by God himself. To take the cross was to serve both faith and eternity. For a knight, it was the highest form of devotion, a holy war that promised salvation in exchange for valour. Sir William de Morley heard the call as it echoed through every hall of England. The message was clear and relentless. Pope Gregory had declared another crusade to reclaim what had been lost after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin's armies. King Richard, son of Henry II, vowed to lead it himself. To follow the Lionheart into battle for God's cause was a dream that stirred the soul of every English knight. William was no longer young. The years had hardened his face, but not his spirit. He had fought, ruled, and prayed, but there remained within him the restless fire of purpose that had guided him since his youth. His estate prospered. and his name was known among the baron's vassals, yet he felt that something essential remained unfinished. Knighthood was more than rank, and reward it was service. To die in the Holy Land, sword in hand and soul in grace, was the ideal to which generations of knights had aspired. And so, in the spring of 1189, William de Morley took the cross. The ceremony of the taking of the cross was simple yet profound. Before the altar he knelt, and a priest placed a piece of red cloth, cut in the shape of a cross, upon his shoulder. This cross marked him as a crusader, bound by vow to fight for the faith. He pledged his lands to the care of his steward, arranged for the protection of his tenants, and made his peace with family and friends. To prepare for the long journey, he sold 2 of his finest horses, for every crusader had to finance his own campaign. In the weeks that followed, the roads filled with men like him, nobles, squires, priests, and common soldiers, marching southward toward the coast. They gathered at ports in Dorset and Sussex, where ships waited to bear them across the Channel. There was an air of determination among them, but also fear. Many would never return. The journey to the Holy Land was perilous. Storms, disease, and the sheer length of the voyage tested even the strongest hearts. William sailed with a contingent of knights loyal to Baron Fitzalan, now an aging man who nevertheless refused to stay behind. Their ship, small and crowded, creaked under the weight of armour, horses, and supplies. The sea was unforgiving. For weeks they battled wind and wave until at last they reached the coast of Normandy. From there they marched across Europe, through France, and down to the Mediterranean port of Marseille, where the crusading fleets gathered. The journey across Europe was a revelation. William saw the power and diversity of Christendom, the bustling cities of France, the fortified monasteries of the Alps, the ancient Roman roads that still bore the footprints of empire. He also saw the suffering left in the wake of crusade villages stripped of food, peasants taxed into ruin, and the weary faces of those who'd seen too many armies pass their gates. The dream of holy war was glorious in song, but brutal in practice. By the time William S. Company reached the coast of Sicily, news spread that King Richard himself had arrived. The Lionheart S presence filled the Crusaders with new resolve. Richard was everything a knight could hope to follow, fearless, commanding, and devout. His charisma turned men into armies, his sword into legend. For William, who had spent years living by the ideals of chivalry, to serve under such a king was both an honour and a trial. The crusade would test not only his courage, but his faith in the very ideals that had shaped him. The voyage from Sicily to the Holy Land was long and deadly. Tempest scattered fleets, and disease stalked the holds of the ships. Men died by the dozen, their bodies consigned to the waves. William survived, though weakened by fever. When at last the fleet reached Acre, the sight before them was both awe-inspiring and terrible. The city, one of the last strongholds of the Saracens on the coast, was under siege by the Crusaders. Smoke curled from its towers, and the plains around it were littered with the wreckage of war-broken siege engines, fallen banners, the bones of men and horses. For months, the siege dragged on. William fought side by side with his companions, enduring the stench of death and the endless grind of battle. Every day, arrows darkened the sky. Stones hurled by catapults shattered walls and men alike. Disease spread through the camps, claiming more lives than any sword. Yet through it all, the Crusaders persisted, driven by faith and the promise of redemption. During one assault on the city walls, William distinguished himself once more. when the enemy counterattacked and threatened to break through the Crusaders' lines, he rallied his men, seized a fallen banner, and led a charge that drove the Saracens back behind their gates. His bravery was noted by his superiors, and for the first time he fought not merely as a knight of England, but as a soldier of Christendom, a warrior of a cause greater than any feudal bond. When Acre finally fell, the victory was both triumph and tragedy. The city was taken, but at a dreadful cost. Thousands lay dead, and the divisions among the Crusaders soon became evident. Disputes between the kings of England and France, between Templars and Hospitallers, between lords seeking glory and those seeking peace, fractured the unity of the cause. William, though weary, remained steadfast. He had sworn his oath, and he would see it through. From Acre, the army marched south toward Jerusalem. The journey was brutal. The desert heat scorched their armour, and the land itself seemed cursed, barren, hostile, endless. Yet amid the hardship, William found moments of reflection. The sight of the Holy Land stirred something deep within him. To stand where Christ had walked, to see the hills of Judea and the ancient walls of the city they sought to reclaim it, gave meaning to every wound, every sleepless night. But the campaign did not end as the Crusaders had hoped. Though they won battles and captured fortresses, Jerusalem remained beyond their grasp. Negotiations and exhaustion brought the campaign to a halt. King Richard, after years of war, agreed to a truce with Saladin, allowing Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy City, but leaving it under Muslim control. It was a compromise that disappointed many, but it was peace nonetheless. For William, the end of the crusade was both relief and revelation. He had fought for faith, endured suffering beyond imagining, and returned alive. Yet he also understood now the complexity of the world he had sought to simplify. The Saracens were not the monsters he had been told they were. He had seen their discipline, their courage, their reverence for their own faith. He realized that valor and devotion were not bound by nation or creed. In this understanding lay the deepest lesson of his journey. When he finally returned to England, years older and forever changed, William found his homeland much as he had left it, yet somehow smaller. The fields seemed gentler, the castles less grand. He brought back no riches, no trophies, only the memory of what he had seen and the wisdom it had given him. His people welcomed him as a hero, but he felt no triumph, only gratitude. He resumed his duties as lord of his estate, ruling with a newfound humility. The experiences of war had stripped him of pride. He treated his tenants with fairness, offered protection to the weak, and ensured that justice in his hall was tempered with mercy. His faith was quieter now, less the fervour of crusade, more the steady devotion of a man who had seen both the glory and folly of men in the name of God. In time, Sir William became known not for his victories but for his wisdom. Younger knights sought his counsel, and he trained squires as his masters had trained him. He taught them not only the use of the sword but the purpose behind it, that strength without virtue was corruption, and that the truest battle a knight fought was not against flesh and blood, but against the darkness within himself. As the years passed, the world around him changed. Kings died, borders shifted, wars rose and fell. But the essence of knighthood, the call to serve, to protect, to live honourably remained. William de Morley had become the embodiment of that ideal, not through wealth or conquest, but through endurance and integrity. The boy who once dreamed of banners and glory had found instead the quiet nobility of duty fulfilled. The years that followed Sir William de Morley's return from the Holy Land were marked by peace, or at least as much peace as medieval England could know. The fires of crusade had dimmed, and the kingdom turned once more to the affairs of its own soil, its harvests, its rivalries, its laws. The aging knight found himself in a world that seemed at once familiar and foreign. The ideals that had driven him through youth and war still burned within him, but the world around him was changing. By the turn of the 13th century, England was no longer the same realm that had raised him. The long reign of King Henry II had given way to the turbulent rule of his sons. Richard the Lionheart, the hero of the Crusade, had died far from home, struck down by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in France. His death had cast a long shadow across the land, for he had embodied the warrior king, brave, proud, unyielding. His brother, King John, now wore the crown, but his reign would prove far different. Where Richard had united his knights through faith and conquest, John ruled through fear and suspicion. Heavy taxes, political quarrels with his barons, and bitter disputes with the church eroded the unity of the realm. For men like William, who had lived by the bonds of loyalty and service, this new age brought unease. The code of chivalry, once clear and sacred, began to fray beneath the weight of ambition and corruption. Still, William held fast to his principles. His manor in Norfolk became a place of order and refuge. Travellers were welcomed, the poor were fed, and disputes were settled with fairness. He no longer sought war or renown. Instead, he sought to preserve the spirit of knighthood in a world that seemed to be forgetting it. He took under his care a young squire named Thomas, the son of a neighbouring minor noble. Thomas reminded him of himself at that age, eager, reckless, and full of dreams of glory. William saw in the boy the same hunger for honour that had once burned in his own heart. It became his mission to teach him what experience had taught him, that the heart of a knight was not forged in victory, but in virtue. Their days followed a rhythm that echoed William's youth decades before. Mornings began with training in the courtyard, riding, swordplay, and archery. Thomas practiced tirelessly, his energy boundless. William, slower now but still commanding, instructed him with patience. He corrected every movement, every stance, until each action reflected not just skill, but control. A knight S-arm, he told him, must obey his judgment, not his anger. In the afternoons they walked the estate together, visiting tenants and farmers. William taught him to see beyond titles and armour, to understand the lives of those who worked the soil that sustained them. To protect the weak, he said, you must first know them. A knight who rules without compassion is no better than the wolf who preys upon his flock. Evenings were devoted to study. They read from the Psalms, from chronicles of old battles, and from the new writings of scholars who spoke of law and governance. For William, learning had always been part of the knight's duty. Strength without knowledge was dangerous. Knowledge without faith was empty. In Thomas he hoped to create not just a warrior, but a man of conscience. Yet as he trained his young squire, William could not ignore the shifting tides of his age. The world was growing less romantic, more practical. Warfare itself was changing. The rise of mercenaries, the growing importance of archers and infantry, and the introduction of new tactics threatened to make the heavily armoured knight less central on the battlefield. Castles were still symbols of power, but they were no longer invincible. Siege engines and strategy now decided wars as much as valour. The feudal order that had defined his entire life was beginning to crumble. Many knights no longer held their lands through personal loyalty, but through contracts and payments. The sacred bond of vassal and lord, sealed by oaths, honour, and service, was being replaced by coin. For William, This erosion of duty was a painful sight. The age of chivalry was waning, giving way to an age of politics and law. When King John S. conflicts with his barons erupted into open revolt, William faced a difficult choice. His loyalty to his king was absolute by oath, yet his conscience told him that justice was being trampled. The barons demanded a charter of rights to limit the king's power, a document that would come to be known as the Magna Carta. For the first time, the knights of England were forced to question whether obedience to a corrupt ruler could coexist with their vow to uphold justice. William was torn. He prayed long and earnestly for guidance. In his youth, such questions would never have arisen. Duty to one's liege was sacred, unbreakable. But age had taught him that honour was not blind obedience. It was the courage to do what was right, even when it meant standing alone. In the end, he lent quiet support to the barons' cause. He sent men to aid them, though he himself did not take the field. When the Magna Carta was signed at Runnymede in 1215, he took it as a sign that perhaps the spirit of justice he had always served still lived in England, even if the world around him had changed. In his later years, William withdrew more and more from public life. His strength began to fail, but his mind remained sharp. He spent long hours in his solar, reading by candlelight, or walking slowly among the fields at dusk. He was often seen kneeling in the small chapel he had built years before. His sword laid beside him, its blade worn thin from decades of use. To those who knew him, he was a living relic of a fading age, a man whose life spanned the rise and decline of the knightly ideal. Thomas, now a young man, was knighted under William's sponsorship. The ceremony mirrored the one William had known in his own youth, though the times were darker. As he performed the accolade, touching his sword to the young man's shoulders, William spoke the same words Sir Robert had once spoken to him. Be valiant, loyal, and true. Yet he added one more. And remember that your honour is not in the eyes of men, but in the sight of God. Thomas went on to serve with distinction, and for many years afterward he would speak of Sir William de Morley as the greatest knight he had ever known, not because of his victories, but because of his steadfastness. As William aged, his thoughts often returned to the beginning of his journey, the day he had left home as a boy, the long years as a page and squire, the battlefields of France and Acre, the faces of those who had fought beside him and fallen. He saw how time had transformed him from student to master, from seeker of glory to guardian of peace. What remained constant through triumph and loss was the code that had defined him: courage, loyalty, and faith. He understood now that chivalry was not a relic of the past, nor a set of rules carved in stone. It was a living principle, passed from one generation to the next through example. The armour might change, the weapons might evolve, but the heart of a knight, the desire to serve something greater than oneself, could never die. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside his hall, William called for his steward and asked to see the sword that had been his companion since the Holy Land. It was old now, its edge dulled, its grip worn smooth by time. He held it for a long while in silence. Then, with steady hands, he placed it upon the altar in his chapel, as he had done on the night of his vigil so many years before. "I have carried you long enough," he murmured. "Let peace bear you now." He died not long after, surrounded by his household and his former squire. His passing was quiet, without fanfare. He was buried in the chapel he'd built beneath a simple stone engraved with the words "Servus Fidei et Honoris," a servant of faith and honour. To those who remembered him, Sir William de Morley represented the best of what a knight could be. His life spanned the full arc of chivalry's golden age, from its hopeful rise to its gradual decline. He had seen war and peace, pride and humility, faith and doubt. Through it all, he had remained true to the promise he made as a boy, to live with honour and to serve with integrity. When Sir William de Morley was laid to rest in his small stone chapel, few could have known that the world he represented was passing into memory. His death marked the end of an era, the twilight of the true medieval knight. The age that followed would see the transformation of England and of Europe itself. Castles would crumble before gunpowder, feudal oaths would give way to royal decrees and written law. Yet even as the armour rusted and the banners faded, the idea of knighthood endured. The young man William had knighted Sir Thomas carried his memory like a torch. In him, the lessons of his master lived on. Where others saw only the glamour of battle, Thomas remembered William's words about mercy and restraint. He taught his own squires that courage without conscience was hollow, and that the sword was never to be drawn for pride or cruelty. He spoke of his old mentor's calm judgment, his fairness to the lowly, and his quiet faith. To Thomas and his household, William S. life became legend, a pattern to follow, a measure of worth. As decades turned to centuries, England itself changed beyond recognition. The feudal order that had defined William's world slowly disintegrated. The barons' revolts gave rise to a monarchy constrained by law, and the Magna Carta that William had quietly supported became the foundation of English liberty. The knight's oath of loyalty to a single lord evolved into loyalty to the realm itself. Yet the values at the heart of chivalry, honour, courage, faith and service were absorbed into the very fabric of English identity. The 13th and 14th centuries brought new wars, the Scottish campaigns, the long and bloody 100 Years' War against France. Once more, the fields of Europe rang with the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves. But the nature of warfare was changing. At Crécy and Poitiers, English longbowmen shattered the dominance of armoured cavalry. No longer could the charge of a mounted knight decide a battle. The age of plate armour and heavy lances waned before the rise of discipline, range and gunpowder. And yet, paradoxically, it was in this decline that the ideal of the knight grew stronger than ever. The poets and chroniclers of the later Middle Ages, Geoffrey de Charny in France, Geoffrey Chaucer in England, immortalised the image of the noble warrior bound by faith and duty. They turned the lived reality of men like William de Morley into a symbol, the knight as moral exemplar, defender of the weak, servant of truth. Even as the world no longer needed knights in armour, it longed for their spirit. In the courts of kings and queens, the notion of chivalry became a code of conduct rather than a military role. Orders of knighthood, such as the Order of the Garter, founded by King Edward III, preserved the rituals and ceremonies of the old age while transforming them into marks of honour and service to the crown. The sword and the vigil, the dubbing and the oath, these survived, but they now spoke more of loyalty to country and virtue than of feudal duty. In this new world, Sir William's life would have seemed distant, yet familiar. The heart of his code, humility, justice, devotion still resonated. The knight had become less a warrior and more a symbol of an ideal humanity. Chivalry, once born in the chaos of battle, became the conscience of a civilization. By the 15th century, armour reached its peak of beauty and futility. The suits crafted for tournaments gleamed like polished mirrors, masterpieces of artistry more than instruments of war. Tournaments themselves, once practical training for combat, became elaborate spectacles of pageantry, knightly theatre where valour was displayed, not proven. But even in these rituals, echoes of the old spirit remained. the courtesy, the discipline, the reverence for oaths and honour. Then came the guns. Cannon shattered castle walls that had stood for centuries. Muskets pierced armour that no smith could strengthen enough. Warfare grew colder, more distant, less personal. The knight on horseback, who once ruled the battlefield, became a relic. The chivalric code designed for a world of hand-to-hand combat and sacred vows struggled to find meaning in a landscape of powder